Welcome to Antarctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Howard Whelan was raised in the Rocky Mountains, USA, and moved to Australia in 1979. His passion for the outdoors, skiing and climbing, led to a 4,000-kilometer, 5-month bushwalk from Canada to Mexico on what has become the Pacific Crest Trail. He has also guided on the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea and the Shackleton Crossing of South Georgia, as well as winter traverses of Europe's Pennine Alps and Hokkaido's Central Mountain Range. He was cameraman on the successful first Australian Everest expedition. Founding editor, then publisher of Australian Geographic, Howard left to set up Whelan Productions, which offers media and logistical support specializing in polar and other remote regions. He's led more than 80 scientific, filming, and tourist expeditions to Antarctica, the subantarctic islands, Greenland, the Siberian Arctic, and the Russian Far East. These include the Academy Award-winning Happy Feet, the first commercial expedition to traverse the Northeast Passage, and logistics for Tim Jarvis's Shackleton Epic. He recently curated Trailblazers, Australia's 50 Greatest Explorers, at the Australian Museum. Howard is a fellow of the Explorers Club, a senior guide in the Polar Tourism Guide Association, and holds a private pilot's license. Howard Whelan, welcome to Antarctic Stories.
Thanks, Heather. Good to be here.
I'm so excited to speak to you, and there are so many things that I want to ask that I just wasn't sure where to start. Your bio reads like, I don't even know. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. So perhaps we can just start at the beginning and hear a little bit about your genesis story. Now, I understand that you had your first real exposure to the polar world when you went up to Alaska for work right after high school. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and then what that kind of led to, the next thing in your life that slowly brought you deeper into the polar world?
Okay. May I digress for a quick moment, though?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I think it's only fair to say that prior to going to Alaska, I grew up in Utah. And so that gave me a great love of the colder climes. You know, we grew up in the Salt Lake Valley and started skiing when I was 5, and so I really fell in love. I fell in love with the snow and the ice at a very early age. When I was in high school, my father took on another job up in Seattle and in the Pacific Northwest, and so it's a slightly complicated story. But when I finished high school, my parents had organized for me to go up to fish on a very small fishing boat with this old guy named Jasper Heath. He was about 65 years old at the time, and he was a bushman. He had, built his own log cabin. He was a bush pilot, a bit of a preacher. He was he was a wild man. And my parents wanted me to go. They thought it'd be, just sort of help me to go and spend some time with this guy. And we started fishing out of Dillingham, Alaska on a 27-foot double ender. And we went out and we fished for weeks at a time out in the Bering Sea. And it was incredible. It was, intimidating. I remember the first day we sailed out, and this tiny little boat with a little 4-cylinder Alaskan lugger engine, and it was just going boom, boom, boom. And away we went, and we went straight out into about an 8 to 10 meter sea. It was just like, oh my God, this is, what is this thing? I grew up in the mountains, I'm not sure about this ocean stuff, And, but it was fantastic, and it really I saw my first blue whale one beautiful glassy day. So all of a sudden there was a splash next to the boat, and this thing was about 3 times the size of the boat, and it just rose up. And
wow.
It was incredible. And so we just, and I had my first experience with grizzly bears up there, and when the salmon season was closed, we used to take the boat up the Nushagak or the Naknek River and up into these beautiful places, Lake Iliamna and it's really, really magnificent, special places. So I got a supercharged start on the polar regions. It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, sounds like it.
It was, no, it was great. Anyway, I came back and I tried to settle down. I went to a year of university at University of Portland, and then I was starting my second year up at talking about doing the second year, and I couldn't do it. I wanted to go back to Utah, the mountains. So I had an old Volkswagen. I put 4 pairs of skis on the back of it, on this bug, and I drove down. And I had my 18th birthday in the parking lot of Alta.
Okay.
And I got to know the guys there working in the lodge, and I got my first job there was, cleaning toilets in the day lodge. And I spent the next 3 seasons, well, nearly four, between Alta and then a year over in Switzerland, and gradually got my way up into a decent job working work in country search and rescue at Alta, which was fantastic, and that was great up to a point. I then felt that I really needed to get a profession, something besides what I was doing, and so I went back to university and did a Bachelor of Science in Mass Communications. And then at the University of Washington, I went back down to Utah and did a postgrad in cinematography, and became a journalist. Really, that was my chosen profession. But I had the opportunity to either go into investigative journalism or, you know, had a number of choices there when I graduated. But I wanted to do adventure. That was the thing. And luckily, there was a company in New York called Zift Publishing, and they asked me to do some work for them. And I started to write about adventure. And then I actually came down to Australia to write about adventure in Australia and the Pacific, in the Pacific countries down here, the island countries. And that's how I ended up becoming an Australian, basing myself here, and absolutely fell in love with the place.
So now it was 1979 that you went to Australia, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you were working there in journalism, and a few years later, there was sort of this connection that arose to Antarctica when you were asked to produce a brochure for an Antarctic expedition cruise. So how did you go from creating a brochure for an Antarctic cruise to actually working on expedition ships? That's a pretty big leap.
It was a big leap. There were a few little hops along the way.
Yeah.
What happened was I was doing some brochures for a company called Australian Himalayan Expeditions. And some of my friends were there, and I sort of helped out and taught a bit of climbing and things. And apparently there's a fellow by the name of Dick Smith who saw the brochures I was doing, and so he made contact and he said, "Look, I really want to charter a ship and take it to Antarctica, and I need somebody to do a brochure. Will you do one for me?" So I met this guy. He was running a retail electronic chain, and you know, he seemed like a kind of an eccentric, adventurous kind of guy. And so we worked together for 10 days. That was it. Put together a brochure. The cruise sold out in about 10 days.
Wow.
Which is, incredible. But then it was back. It was with Lindblad that he was going to charter the ship. But then Lindblad hooked up with Saline and sold the Saline, and Dick was uncomfortable with, dealing with the company he didn't really know, and so he canceled the trip. And that was, my first taste of Antarctica down the tube. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. And then shortly thereafter, I was asked to go. And Channel 9 was one of the local stations here, and they were sponsoring some of my friends on the first Australian ascent of Everest. And so I got hired as a cameraman, and I went with them. And on of the two guys who summited, one was a guy named Greg Mortimer.
Yeah.
And we became very, very good friends. And he ended up starting Aurora Expeditions. And at the same time he was doing that, Dick Smith had decided to start a geographic magazine, and he asked me to start that. And then eventually, after we'd done the first edition, was up in Japan getting printed, he asked if I wanted to be the editor. And I said, well, I actually just edited that, but yeah, that'd be great. and that's how it began. And then we Yeah, so that was part of my life for nearly 17 years. It was great, and it was
Yeah.
fantastic. So because I could have decent holidays, and Greg asked me if I would like to lead some expeditions for him in Antarctica, and that's how that happened.
Oh my
So every
goodness.
year I would every year I would go south. That was from about 1993 onwards. So
Okay, so it was the when did you I mean, oh, okay, I've got to go back for a second because there was this
okay.
big part where you talked about getting to go to Everest and being the cameraman for the first Australian expedition to Everest, which I definitely don't want to gloss over for the folks listening because that's a pretty polar experience. What year did that happen?
That was in 1984,
Okay.
and we had an amazing team of climbers and film crew too, by the way.
Yeah.
It was I was working with a guy named Mike Dillon, and Mike was a superb cameraman, film producer. I think he'd done 9 films by then with Sir Edmund Hillary in the Himalaya.
Wow.
And really fantastic. And the team that we had Greg Mortimer,
Hmm.
Tim McCartney, Snape, Lincoln Hall, Jeff Bartram, Andy Henderson, really terrific guys. And on assisting with the film crew was Jim Duff, who was an old Everest hand, and he was our doctor, a guy named Colin Monteith, and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. Oh, Simon Balderston, who was a journalist from Melbourne who came, and we had two Nepalis with us. We had Tenzing Sherpa, and we had Naran Shrestha. Naran was a Nuwari from Kathmandu, and
Hmm.
that's it. That was the team. We had no additional porters or Sherpas. We came in from the Tibetan side, and we had virtually the whole north face to ourselves. And so the route the guys had put up was up the Great Couloir, and the Americans had tried it the year before and had not been able to make it, and they were back on Everest on the north side, but they were going up the North Ridge,
Hmm.
and they were really jealous. They just said, "Oh, we're so you guys would get to pioneer a new route and the whole thing." Anyway, the guys did. It was incredible. It was an intensely challenging route. I don't think it's had a second ascent.
Hmm.
A lot of avalanche danger. We had to carry everything up, and we had no oxygen. We didn't have any oxygen with us. We
Wow.
had one cylinder for first aid at the bottom, and it really, in hindsight, now that time has passed, and certainly it's been recognized as one of the great Everest climbs, and at a time that was totally different because there were no commercial guides on
Hmm.
the mountain. We had 3.5 months where it was just the 12 of us
Wow.
on the north side, and we skied some of it, and we just had a fantastic time. It was really really wonderful.
It really sounds magical. And, it must feel so wonderful for you to have been there at a time when it wasn't commercialized yet, when you were the only ones there, or almost the only ones there, taking stabs at climbing. And then conversely, in Antarctica, you also were there in reasonably early days. I mean, Antarctic tourism started much earlier than when you started there, but
Mm.
it started to get more commercialized in the 80s and 90s. So you still, with Greg, who you met, as you mentioned, climbing Everest and
Mm.
became good friends. Greg then went and started Aurora Expeditions, which still to this day is one of the biggest Antarctic operators, very well known. And then Dick Smith, going and doing his Antarctic cruise expeditions. You sort of
Hmm.
had all these really interesting connections to people that were really keen to start or grow cruise expedition operations in Antarctica at a time when not many people were doing it.
No, that's right. It was. I mean, there were only probably I could think of about three other companies, maybe four working, including Aurora,
Yeah.
in the early days, and we were. It was all made possible by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and suddenly you had these fantastic ice-strengthened ships, pretty rough and ready, but they were there, and they were able to be chartered for, not a lot of money at the time,
Yeah.
and it was great. And there's a fellow who anybody in the industry would know, Mike McDowell. He's an Australian who was very involved in the original setup of Quark, and prior to that, he'd been an expedition leader with Lindblad for a decade or so, and he's a bit of a genius. And he and Greg became good friends. And in fact, Greg started off working with Mike as his expedition leader, but he subcontracted on the first trip that he led, and that was really the beginning of Aurora Expeditions. But yeah, so back at that time, it was freedom. We used to look for scientific papers that would sort of give us clues as to, what was being studied, where the penguin colonies were, and what might be worth looking at. And quite often we didn't know what we were going to be looking at. We would just sort of pick a spot and go and go have a look. And Greg was very good as he made these beautiful mud maps, and he started this tradition. So then when we go to new places, we'd create these new mud maps, and then that became sort of the corporate memory, if you like. And it really, we sort of would pride ourselves if we'd see another boat, which was rare. We'd just go to a different place. We would move on. And at the same time, there was a great sense of responsibility to look after, we appreciated the environment that we were seeing. And funnily enough, we were seeing stuff that we weren't happy about, which was, a lot of the stations we were visiting. And bear in mind, we weren't just going to the Antarctic Peninsula or South Georgia. We were also coming out of Fremantle, going to Heard Island, down into East Antarctica.
Right.
And down into the Ross Sea, and we were seeing government stations that were just trashed. They were in terrible condition. And on the way back from these trips, we used to get people we'd get people together, and we'd give them addresses who they could write to try and get things to change. So I think that really, people say, don't you feel bad about sort of, possibly, bringing humans into Antarctica? And I always say no. Actually, I'm really proud of the fact that we actually were able to change the way Antarctica was seen by the governments that were working down there, and we put pressure on them to start to develop some environmental guidelines. And you look at places like Bellinghausen now, and places in the South Shetlands that they look fantastic. And I can tell you, when we first went there, they were garbage tips. It's so anyway. It was a fun time, exciting time. We were working out a lot of stuff as it went along.
It must have been so interesting, especially in places like the peninsula. And I haven't been to the other side of Antarctica, so I'm only really familiar with the peninsula. But there are very few, relatively speaking, landing spots where you can go ashore and be with penguins, because so much of the Antarctic Peninsula just rises almost directly out of the ocean, so you can't step on land. And it must have been so amazing to be down there with these old Russian ships that had these high capabilities to push through ice and finding new spots.
It was fantastic. I mean, I remember, do you remember the Millennium New Year, 2000, when all the computers were supposed to freak out? And it became a thing. There were people who wanted to escape, because the world was going to end. And so we had that New Year's Eve, we had more ships down there than we'd ever had before. I remember looking, and it was like 13 ships, might have been yachts and ships down there. And for us, that was like, and I remember I was at the bar in Ushuaia, and I said to some other expedition leaders, I said, I'm going to take the boat around to the Weddell Sea, because it's just going to be madness on the peninsula, Yeah. And they all looked at me and they just said, "You're insane. You can't, you can't take your ship around there." Had a fantastic captain, and who was just, as soon as I mentioned it, he said, "Let's do it." And we went around. We got down to Snow Hill, and we landed at Seymour for the first time that a tourist ship had landed at Seymour, and we spent New Year's Eve at Deuce Bay, near the old British. There's an old British hut site there with the old dog lines and stuff, and it was so exciting. It was that was what really got my team going. And the passengers, I mean, Greg was fantastic, because I used to say to him, now, is there anything you want, have you done market research on the passengers, and what do they want, and the whole thing. And Greg used to say, what do they want? He said, if you're having a good time, they're going to have a good time. And and you know what? It was so successful. He had an unbelievable, return rate. The passengers became like family. We had a great time. And everybody, it was interesting. it was interesting that he put that trust in us, and it was great.
Yeah. But that's a really good bit of wisdom, and it's something that I still hear these days spoken about, because there's the race to add in more things, right? Like add in kayaking, add in this, add in that, add in all these new activities and stuff. But people who have been working in the industry for a long time know that, sure, there are a few adventure activities and things that can enhance a person's experience down there. But actually, if the expedition team is excited, if they're plugged in, if they're having an amazing time and sharing their knowledge of the region, the passengers always have an amazing time.
And the number of people who, at the end of a trip, and you say to them, what did you like best? Was it climbing that thing or skiing that thing? The number of people say, oh, it was when we took the Zodiacs into Scunthorpe Cove and turned off the engines and we could hear the ice cracking.
Yes.
And then you're just going, well, there you go. Says it all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the simple things. It's the being present and being there. It's just amazing. Well, that dovetails really beautifully into another question that I have, because you've been going to up until 2020, when this wonderful pandemic hit, you'd been going back to Antarctica every single year. So back when you were working for or running Australian Geographic, you had time off, you could go down in the season and whatnot, and then just continued on afterwards. So that's a very illustrious Antarctic career, and I'm sure there are so many incredible experiences that you've had. But are there one or two moments that really stand out the most, or that really took your breath away?
The first trip, coming back from the first trip, I will never forget it. It was, we were on Vavilov, and we had started in the Falklands, and we were going to finish in Ushuaia. And we went Falklands, South Georgia. We came around that way, and oh, no, we didn't. No, we did not. We went Falklands straight down to the South Shetlands. And we had spent, 12 days or 14 days down there. We were coming back just off the tip of the peninsula near Antarctic Sound. And as the ship was going away, I was on the back of the deck. I was looking out, and I was by myself. And I could just see these tabular icebergs were kind of looking, beautiful in the evening light. And there were some Adelie penguins. They were sort of porpoising behind the ship, and they were kind of falling further and further behind. And I saw the beauty of this place, and I started to tear up a bit, because I just thought, my God, what if I never get a chance to see this again in my life? It would be devastating. Little did I know that, I was about to, see it. And the amazing thing is that, the trips I did just before COVID, I had those moments, I had the moments of the grandeur, the beauty, that it just doesn't change. It's a power place. Anyway, that was one. God, oh man, there's so many. I think probably getting to visit not just Oster-Rookery in East Antarctica near Mawson Station. Oh God, we had a funny one. There's an amazing Australian by the name of Dr. Philip Law. And Philip Law, was responsible for setting up all of the Australian bases in Antarctica in the mid-50s, and really just using old war surplus stuff and airplanes and larks and things and old Quonset huts and everything. And he actually moved some huts from Heard Island down to start Mawson Station. And it's remote. This place is seriously remote. But anyway, so in about 1998, I think it was 98, 99, we went down and we took Philip Law to go back. It was the first time he'd been back in, I don't know, maybe 50 years or something, or 40 years. Anyway, a long time. And I'll never forget, we took him into, and there was all this talk, the guys at Mawson Station, they were saying, oh, we're going to take you, we want to take you to Law Hut. We've got this place here called Law Hut, it's and he was quite excited about that. Oh, it's very nice, and the whole thing is so typical. This is such Australian humor. Anyway, they went and part of a tour, taken around, and then finally they went to Law Hut, which was the toilet facilities. It was so funny. Anyway, he loved it. He burst out laughing. He just thought that was so funny. Uh, but look,
That's
I mean,
great.
there were, oh God, I could, there's a place called Skull and Monolith, and it looks like something out of, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's right on the coast, and this glacier kind of wraps around it, and it's about 2,000 feet high, and it's seabird cliffs, and it's really, really wild.
Wow.
And we were there, and there was just this wind scour off of this one thing, and ice cliffs on the other, and we were there just as katabatic wind started to pick up, and we were kind of stuck. We couldn't go anywhere. We were on an icebreaker. We were on the Klebnikov at the time, so he pulled in
Hmm.
close to the ice cliffs, and I could see that we could get zodiacs in the water, and there was just this little bit of leeway where it was protected from the ice cliffs. And what we would do is I told everybody
Mhm.
to just get the warmest gear on possible, and we put everybody in the zodiacs, and we came around this corner into the katabatic wind, which must have been blowing about 70 knots. It was just like screaming, and we just would put our noses
Whoa.
around just so everybody could get this blast of, feel that power coming in. And so we do that, and we did it about 2 or 3 times. We didn't want to freeze everybody. But as we came back out of that and everybody's pumped, the adrenaline, we just looked up at these ice cliffs about 20 meters above us, and you could see the spindrift and the clouds of blown snow and ice crystals going over, and underneath that was the layer of snow petrels, like these flocks of snow petrels, like these ghosts just swimming, just flying back and forth under that. And it was just the power and the beauty of that experience. It was that kind of that stuck.
Yeah.
That was.
It sounds absolutely otherworldly. Like, I'm trying to imagine it. Having been to Antarctica and like kind of understanding what it looks like there, I'm still struggling to grasp how amazing that would have been. It sounds so unique. This is in East Antarctica, right? Where
Yeah,
these cliffs
yeah,
are?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's over near between Mawson and Davis, I
Okay. Yeah.
recall. But
Oh.
I mean, look, they're you could find the same. You'd find similar experiences when you go down through the gullet and
Mm-hmm.
down on the peninsula side. I'm sure many of us have experienced pushing through the ice or occasionally getting a clear run through,
Yeah.
and I just there's lots of good stuff there.
There's so much good stuff. Oh, it's really making me want to go back right
I
now.
know, I know. God, we're desperate.
For sure. This is not the time to be sitting doing podcast episodes about how wonderful it is about making ourselves miserable. Oh, anyways, it's good to reminisce and look
Yes,
forward to the next time.
absolutely.
So, on the flip side, of course, with so many years going down there must have been some terrifying experiences, I'm assuming,
Oh,
especially considering, like the Antarctic Peninsula is remote, but there's lots of human presence there with scientific stations and whatnot. But the East Antarctic is even more remote. And, Mother Nature does what she wants.
Mother
So, are
Nature.
there. Yeah. Are there any instances that really stand out for you that you'd rather not relive?
Yes, there are a couple. One was on the way down to East Antarctica from Fremantle, and it was the year after Philip Law was with us, and we were going down. It was the year that the Sydney to Hobart yacht race was hit by this incredible low pressure system that actually some sailors died. It was quite dramatic, and we were actually in the Indian Ocean, and we got hit by that low pressure system before it got to Australia. And it was, I remember being in the dining room. This was on Klebnikov, which, by the way, was not a fantastic ship to have in the Southern Ocean. It used to roll 55 degrees through either side.
Oh,
So
man.
it rolled through 110 degrees. It was unbelievable. But anyway, this time we were going into the storm, and I was down in the dining room, and we hit a wave, and everything, as happens, the ship stopped, all the cutlery, everything didn't, and so everything came flying forward and crashing and everything. So And I stood up and I said, look, I said, that's okay. I said, we've just hit a big wave, don't worry about that. We'll be all right, and I'm walking towards the door when we hit the next wave. And when we hit this next wave, the same thing happened. We stopped, but the ship, it twisted. I could actually feel in the deck plates beneath me, I could feel the torque of the ship twisting. I could feel the rise of the metal. And I just thought, wow,
Oh.
that's powerful. So I then went and I started to run up the stairs, the internal stairs, to get up to the bridge, which is about on the 10th floor. And I stopped in at about, I think it was about level 8, where I had a cabin at the front of the ship. And my daughter, Sky, who many people would know, she was with us. She was 16. It was her first trip south. And some other friends were in there, including Bill Miller, who I might talk about in a little bit. But they were just sitting there, and I said, are you guys okay? And they said, yeah, we're fine. But look, here comes another one. And I said, another what? And they said, a wave. Look at this. And the third wave, we took 3 waves that went. This one I watched as the bow plowed into the base of this wave. And the wave went over, it was green water over the top of the flying bridge on Klebnikov, which is 11 stories high.
Wow.
So we really, and it ripped the houses off the cranes on the front of the ship. And that was exciting. That was, that was full on.
Yeah.
That was when you really realized the power of the ocean. So that was one. And the other one was in 2006 on a boat that used to be called Marina Svataiva and is now Ortelius. And we were heading down through the New Zealand subantarctics, and we had a really, really, we'd had pretty rough weather coming out of New Zealand. And we were down in Perseverance Harbor, and I was concerned about time. It's a death trap for expedition leaders. I felt the pressure. And I thought we better get, we better get rolling, Anyway, this was way, way before we had really good weather forecasting, but clearly the barometer was going in the wrong direction, and we came out. And I had 2 Russian captains who I have never worked with since. I think after that season, I don't know whether they ever continue working in Antarctica, but we went down and we got caught in, if not a force 12, it was a pretty stiff force 11 storm.
Oh.
And we got beaten up, really, really badly. We had, we had helicopters on the top deck, and we had fuel drums and things, and we were out there in that trying to lash everything down even better. And it taught me something, and it taught me that I need to be able to say, we don't have to go anywhere. We will stay here. We'll stay in the protection of the harbor. It's not worth taking the risk. And I've had to make that call a couple of times since then, and I'm really glad that that I learned that lesson at an early stage. And it's interesting to see with other ships nowadays and the commercial pressures that are on them that people are taking off to cross the Drake when they should be staying in Ushuaia or Port Williams.
Yep. Yeah.
So I'm kind of glad I had that one behind me.
It's very true. And, once you experience that, or once you make the mistake, let's say, it's not something you'll ever do again. I had a similar experience, or I had an experience of being in the really bad Drake back in, it was February 2014, I think. We were hit by a rogue wave, and it took out 3 plate glass windows in the main lounge on deck 3. And these are like inch-thick plate glass,
Yes.
Gone.
Yes. I remember.
Yeah. It was nuts. And like the railing outside, which is metal, was bent completely in from water. And it was just such a good lesson of how nature is boss, and you just should never take those kind of chances, Of course, there will be people disappointed if they lose an extra day because we have to hang back due to weather, but it's just never worth the risk.
No. I think that we're fortunate now. I mean, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think the quality of, I think the industry now is, and this is thanks to guys like Graham Charles and the, Polar Tourist Guide Association, which I will declare I'm a member of and a senior guide. And, I think it's crucial now to be able to have some way of, as we get more and more ships, to be able to make sure you've got expedition leaders who get that,
Yeah.
who understand the importance of being cautious
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah. There are ways to have a good time and not be a cowboy.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can be professional
yeah.
and keep everyone safe, and yeah, we don't need to
And
take
have a
on
good time.
and have a really good time. Yeah, for sure.
I think the thing, the cowboy thing, what I think is important is I think we've got to be careful not to wrap up our guests in cotton wool.
Mm.
I think that it's important for them to experience, some of the wildness of the places that we visit. But of course, our levels of experience are such that, we are so comfortable within that environment. And we can give them like that, like taking the people around to have a look at the catabatics and
Hmm.
things like that.
Hmm.
It wasn't something that was, outside of our comfort levels, but we were being careful to let people taste, some of the wildness. I just think that, we've got to be careful to still have the freedom to be able to, give people a sense of thrill,
Hmm.
safely. It's
Hmm.
always got to be safely.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. But
that's the
that's
main thing.
experience, right? Like
Mm.
experience allows for managed risk.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
that's
think
right.
that's really key. And that's, as you said, you're a member of the PTGA. That's one of the things that I think is so important about having a professional standards association is that,
Mm.
everyone is operating with a level of experience and professionalism that allows for that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's really, really important. I do, on the note of, slightly dangerous things happening,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
do want to jump up to the Arctic for a second because we've been talking only about Antarctica, but you have spent a lot of time in the Arctic over the years as well. And the Arctic
Yes.
has the distinct difference of having a very large predator, the polar bear.
It does. It's funny
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I have no doubt that you have a noteworthy story or two from the cold north, and I'd love to hear one
Mm.
of them.
Well, let's see. Look, the first time I started, the first trips I did, probably like a lot of ELs these days, it was up in Svalbard and up in that area, and it felt different. It felt different from Antarctica because of the polar bears, because of the way we had to manage the safety of our guests. And the first couple of trips I did up there, I think, God, there's so much to learn, and I'm just so envious of you and your mates, the Berg boys.
Hmm.
Because having grown up there, for instance, Aurora, there's a good friend, Christian, who's, he's Swiss, but he's sailed yachts across the Arctic. He's done all this, and it's a place that has its subtleties and understanding. I think in a way, Antarctic understanding is, in a weird way, it's so in your face that you get it immediately. There's kind of this visceral learning that happens. So whereas the Arctic, we spend, like Dave Berg and Henrik, one of our guys, and these guys who grew up in Denmark, they grew up in Scandinavia. That's their history, that's their neighborhood, their home turf. In Antarctica, there is no home turf. There's no local people.
Yeah.
So you can be a Gumby from Australia who's, passionate about mountains and adventure and things, who can go down and, study up, read about it, and know about a bit about the history. But there's something about the cultural understanding of growing up in a place. It's like me, and it's like Utah and I. But so that was something that I found a little bit, like I felt a bit underdone when I first went up
Mm.
there. The
Hmm.
polar bear thing, that has to do with your confidence in managing people and keeping a aware eye out and being confident in your ability with a gun.
Hmm.
These are incredibly important skills. But there was just something else that I found, just it takes time to learn that. Now, my learning up in the European Arctic was quite short because I then got moved over to Aurora was starting to do trips up in the Russian Far East and the Kuril
Mm.
Islands, so Kamchatka, Kurils. And I had the great opportunity to do a couple of seasons there before in 2010 doing the Northeast Passage. So we started from Murmansk and came all the way across through 9 time zones to the Bering Strait and then down through Kamchatka, Kurils, and we finished in Sakhalin. It was 2 months of full-blown, Russia, Siberia experience. And that, for me, I found that drew me in like Antarctica drew me in.
Yeah.
The wildness. And it was also the sense of really exploring, because when we did the Northeast Passage, we didn't have any mud maps, and
Hmm.
getting information of these places was very, very difficult. So it felt every time you were landing, it was like being back in Antarctica 20 years earlier and doing mud maps and keeping notes and writing down what birds were there, how many polar bears we saw.
Hmm.
And for us, going from Murmansk and coming across to we suddenly, I'm thinking about these places that, north of Murmansk you have Novaya Zemlya, then Franz Josef Land, then you continue across the Severnaya Zemlya, then the Novosibirsky Islands, the Taimyr Peninsula, the Iron Island,
Yeah.
the Bear Islands, and then finally you get to kind of the jewel in the crown, which is Wrangel Island. It's
Yeah.
up north of Chukotka, and that place is, that's unique. It's, the last time I was there was about 3 years ago now. And one morning we saw 65 polar bears in 2 hours. It's just
That's
like
crazy.
it's incomprehensible, incomprehensible. And then we went, and Herald Island is a little island off to the east, and we were there the next day, and it's just even same.
Yeah.
And like I'm driving my Zodiac along the coastline, they come around, and Uliana, one of the rangers from Wrangel Island, when you go to Wrangel, you take 3 of their rangers on board, and they stay with you, and they make the call as to, they check out the bears, and these guys live with the bears, and they're incredible. Anyway, so I'm driving my Zodiac, and Uliana calls, and she goes, "Govard." She goes, "Polar bear just above your head." And I looked up, and
What?
here's this beautiful polar bear just sitting like on this little rock, this headland, just as I came around the corner. Oh, okay, so I pulled away quite quickly. and, and then another, say, 30 meters down, there were these 2 or 3 families up this dirt embankment in their dens, kind of sitting on the verandas of their dens, like cubs, mothers, grandmothers.
Wow.
It was, it's good. It's really
It
good.
it sounds magical. It really sounds magical. And I think, especially the Russian Arctic is an area that isn't that well explored. It's still not super easy to book trips up there. There's very few ships that go. There's few companies that do it, and they're not as advertised as, say, a place like Svalbard or the Canadian Arctic, I find. So to just hear about how remote, how wild, and how full of wildlife it is, it's just mind-boggling, and it makes me definitely want to get over there.
Well, I mean, the thing about that, it's the Russian connection there, and that is that,
Mm,
like Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands, that was where they kept their Pacific nuclear fleet,
yeah.
and they did not, and they were looking across from Bering Strait down to southeast Alaska. They're looking, and they're facing the enemy during the Cold
Hmm.
War, and even Russians needed a special visa to go to Kamchatka, and nobody
Wow.
went to the Kuril Islands, not even fishermen,
Hmm.
during the time. And so that meant that they had time where the wildlife was being left alone.
Yeah.
Now the collapse of the Soviet Union changed that. There's been a lot of bad hunting that's gone on. And then people have gone and wiped out a lot of bears and things like this further down, not the polar bears, but and it's Russia's a funny place. It's hard
Mm.
work. It really
Hmm.
is. Every time you go ashore, you have you have to take all your passengers' passports, and there might be this short guy with a big hat who's got a clipboard, and you will stand out in rain in some Mad Max shipyard, and these guys are going through and just being officious,
Yeah.
frustrating, and you just have to kind of deal with it.
Yeah.
It's a hard. You don't have to do that in Antarctica.
No, there's not the bureaucracy when you're out in the field and trying to make things happen.
No, no. But I mean, look. I mean, having said that, if I was offered a trip to go back, and I had my COVID vaccination, so did everybody else within known distances, yes, I would do it. I would do it.
Well, listeners, there are so many wonderful stories that Howard has to share, so we've split this interview in two. Stay tuned for part 2, in which we hear from him about being part of the first push to bring tourists mountaineering in Antarctica, as well as his work on the award-winning film Happy Feet, yes, that Happy Feet, and his reflections on expedition cruising 30 years ago versus now. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have an extra minute, leaving a rating or review for the podcast will really help us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, a family-run agency of polar guides who have spent the last decade working on polar expedition ships. We bring you unparalleled insider expertise in small ship voyages to the Arctic and Antarctica, and we love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.